Hello there, everyone, and welcome back to yet another episode of Psyched to be with you, with me, your host, Christopher Leach, aka Chimp195, on this part of the Blind Psyche network, universe, multiverse timeline that we have going. This is episode 5 of season 4 already, unless I've miscounted, which may have happened, but that's something I can sort out in post. Let's not worry about it. As ever, I have got another fantastic and enthralling guest joining me on the stage, which I'm incredibly excited to chat with. So please, my very special guest, if you could introduce yourself, tell us who you are and what you do.
Sure. I'm Dr. Emily Friedman. I'm an associate professor of English at Auburn University in Alabama in the southeastern US, where I am officially an 18th century expert with training in book history and the digital humanities. But over the last several years, I've become one of the folks involved in the study of tabletop role playing games and actual play, which I teach on an annual basis.
So that already is fascinating to a nerd like me. So I'm here for it. I kind of want to we're gonna pick up this in the reverse thread, and we're gonna go back if we can. So let's talk about the
Sure.
TTRPG and actual play stuff, because I feel like I kind of stumbled across you on the internet, on what was Twitter. Who knows what it'll be by the time this airs.
It's
Um,
still Twitter, guys.
it's still,
Corporations can be dead named.
yeah. Um, I kind of like feel like I knew you as someone who live tweeted Critical Role. That's one of the big things that I feel like I sort of saw on the TL. So how did you end up being able to teach about TTRPGs, which sounds amazing?
Yeah, so it started almost exactly 5 years ago as of the time we are talking, give or take. In 2018, I was in the middle of writing my way into a second book project, and I'd had a long interest in artists and creators and writers who create things outside of mass commercial circulation from the period that I most commonly study, the 18th century, but all the way to today. So I have been in the UK an enormous amount of my working career, mostly in Hampshire around Jane Austen's old stomping grounds, unearthing, recovering the work of writers who were writing for just like groups of friends or intimate acquaintances and that kind of thing. And I knew that this was a project that was going to be of interest to people beyond academia. So I wanted to try to, first of all, write to different fields inside of academia. So 18th centuryist explaining this stuff, not only to my colleagues in the 18th century, but also this was a digital project. This is also a project that has interesting implications for how we describe things in library catalogs. The list goes on and on.
hmm
And so I was writing essays to kind of limber up to figure out how to talk to different people. And I saw a call for papers, which is how a lot of academic work gets created, where Stephanie Hedge and Jennifer Grueling were putting together a volume on tabletop role playing and the digital turn. And I had been watching for the last couple of years, you know, Acquisitions Incorporated's rise from D&D Next into what is now fifth edition, the rise of Critical Role, and on and on. And so I said, you know what, I'm writing all these different articles for different scholarly venues. I can take a month for fun and write a little bit about narrative construction. In other words, how critters, fans of Critical Role, um, find the time to watch what was then hundreds of hours, it's now thousands of hours of content. And the answer is different then than it is now, but I wrote it. It was one of the easiest things I've ever written. It was fun to write, and it came out in 2021, end of 2020. And by that summer, it had already been started adopting into other people's classes. And so my colleague Craig Bertolet in my department said, "Hey, we have this class course number module called Technology, Literacy, and Culture. Why don't you try it as a game class, a game and narrative class?" And I said, "I'm a narratologist and I now have a publication in this, and no one else around here is chomping at the bit to do it." So I tried it out, and the class filled in an hour. And so that's 2021 in the fall. And so, as folks will recall, we were in the early part of a global pandemic. So, simultaneously, several things were happening. One, I couldn't get to the UK or any archive anywhere because they were either shut down or travel was not something that was advised, all those sorts of things. So I'd seen my core project kind of slow down.
Hmm.
And at the same time, I was starting this new class. We were coming back to teaching face to face. And I didn't want students to come to class if they were feeling sick. And this is not a lecture course. It is a class where we play games and we talk about them and we work together. So I had a new pedagogical problem as a teacher. What do I do to keep students looped in even when they can't come to class? So I started recording little videos on YouTube of this is what we did in class today, right after class. And I don't know that my students ever really watched them, but other teachers did. And started getting a lot of contact from educators all over the world who were interested in including games. And I'm not the first person or the most innovative person in the teaching of games, but I was somebody that people could find easily, which meant that I could start to connect people together. And while the class is going on, I start getting messages on Twitter because I'm also, of course, posting a little bit about it there from creators in the space, designers in the space. I think Abria Iyengar was the first person to like slide into my DMs and say, "Is it weird if I come to your class over Zoom?" And no, of course not. It was great. So we've had basically the class has been had two real trademarks. One is that we play games seriously in class and talk about them and connect them to scholarship and ideas. And also, we get this lineup of folks from all the different parts of the tabletop field to come in and be other voices, to look at some call it the industry, some call it the community, some call it the space, so that students can see that this is a dynamic place where people are getting in different ways and they're doing lots of different kinds of things.
So that
So
that
that
was
is
a
that is the
brilliant
transition.
answer, and I can tell that that is one that you've given before, which
Very true.
so that you know your stuff. So I know a little bit about teaching. Have to do that type of thing as part of the PhD and write that. But just for listeners' benefit, maybe if they're less familiar, like we've all been to at least a class once and then realized we didn't like it, right?
Mhm.
Just can you maybe explain for us like how play is beneficial in class? Because a colleague of mine who's saying I'm about to butcher, Bridget Matthews, I don't know how you pronounce. Sorry, Bridget. She actually did her PhD thesis recently in bringing play back to the classroom as an important part of the psychological learning process, the pedagogical process, right? So how did you how did you swing let's play games in class to
Yeah.
academic administrators?
Well, I don't have to, as I famously started my remarks at I don't know famously, but I memorably I think started my comments at Big Bad Con by way of introducing myself to the room as I have tenure and I do what I want. I mean, academic freedom is something that we should bolster and of course is under threat in the US and the UK and elsewhere in all kinds of ways. But at the moment, and I'm touching wood all around me, uh, I have the freedom, the intellectual freedom to say this is a subject worthy of study and not have to kind of defend my pedagogical choices. I'm, of course, observed as all of my colleagues are, and my syllabi are looked at. People are in the loop, but I don't have to get pre-approval, and in fact, my university has been very supportive. I have been the face of many little campaigns and things like that. But it's interesting that you asked this question, because this is a question that my student Erin asked every single one of our guests this time, was what did they see as the importance of games in education? And a lot of the time, when I'm talking to fellow educators who are thinking about incorporating tabletop role playing games, you'll hear answers like they're empathy engines, right? Or that's a very common for, elementary, middle grade, kind of younger. This is the thing that D&D for kids kind of
Mm-hmm.
sells itself on. You'll see other people. Wizards has also leaned very hard into STEAM, right? It's, certain games can be ways to learn math,
Mm-hmm.
and some are about creativity. For me, the purpose of the class is to remove the idea of a utilitarian justification for games. And so what we're doing is taking games quite seriously, not as tools, but as works of art. Um, and works of art have been put to use by different folks at different times, but also kind of exist beyond the mere utilitarian. They are in some ways really dangerous and fascinating things, right? Because I was talking about this with Jade Dragon, who folks might be familiar with, Jay's game, Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast or Wander Home, and we were talking about when a tabletop game gets handed over to a group of players, it's no longer in the designer's control. It can be used in all kinds of ways. This is why anti-colonial games can be really challenging to execute, because, depending on how they're shaped, board game folks have written about this more intensely than I have.
Mm-hmm.
That things can get warped, right? Because no game mechanic survives encounters with the players. And so what we're doing in the class is trying to understand the context of these things as objects of creative production, in the kind of, there's the French theorist, Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about fields of cultural production. And a lot of what we're doing in the class is thinking about these as artistic statements, kind of in conversation with each other, to define what the field of games is, what the field of tabletop is, across time and space, for both, because, tabletop is full of what we call discourse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was not just a social media thing. It has existed for as long as tabletop games have existed, because these kinds of debates about, you know, should you make money off of art, and how is it ethical, and how does labor relate to art, and all of those things are ancient, kind of, debates. And so that's a lot of what we're doing in this space of class. It makes me really challenging to my colleagues who are just like, but I want to know how to teach D&D in class. And it's like, I'd love to be able to help you. It's the one game I don't teach. uh, uh, because, you, in some ways, you can't, and in many cases these days, you don't need to. I asked my students this, term at the end of class if I should. I always ask them, "Does D&D have a place in this class, in terms of like a thing we should teach you how to play?" And the students were more vehement than ever, uh, in which is a big change from 2021, uh, but very insistent that they knew enough about D&D to cope with the scholarship, to understand its place in the landscape. They did not need to necessarily experience it and take the time to do that inside the space of class, which I found really interesting. That took us on a little zigzag, but
No, no, I'm with it. I'm here for it. This is why I love chatting to people, chatting minces, I would say. I think what's really interesting about that is that like D&D, I think, is arguably the most popularized kind of TTRPG, right? It's a lot of people's touchstone for it. We might let me get my
It's
academic
the
hat on.
Kleenex
It's
of TTRPG.
the Kleenex. It's the cultural touchstone, the social linchpin almost of the way the outside world kind of engages with TTRPGs, right? But I actually think that D&D is kind of, I want to say inaccessible, but that's a different issue.
Mhm.
But it's not very approachable if you have no idea. Now there is so much resource that I think is really good, and I think from a player's standpoint, I said this quite a few episodes, but I really like the 2D20 system used in like
Mhm.
June. I think Star Trek as well. Like that's very
Mhm.
like a great way of understanding how players can engage in like the characterization of the role play, which I think is cool. So, so you refer to yourself as a narratologist, is that right?
Yes. Yes. That's
Firstly,
one of the hats that I wear.
love that as a title, by the way. That is like genuinely exquisite. How? What advice would you give to someone who looks at yourself and thinks, "I want to do that. I want that to be my job." What would you say?
Oh boy. Um, I have said more than once. So this is a story I've told a couple of times, but it's a useful story, and that's why I dine out on it, so to speak. Uh, I I once early on in my kind of correspondence with Matthew Mercer said, I think you and I may have the same challenge, which is that we are in dynamic and changing industries, and we've had an unusual kind of success where following a pathway that we fell into is not going to work. Like, I can't give you the advice of be an 18th centuryist. There are literally zero 18th century jobs this year. um to describe anywhere in the United States, or as far as I know in the United Kingdom, because I keep an eye on that too. And and academia is a very challenging industry, and so the answer is something along the lines of, I don't know what the pathway looks like these days. I'm happy to support junior scholars and folks who would like to carve a path, but also am keenly aware that, you know, I was hired into my permanent position the year that the economy crashed in 2008, 2009. So most of the jobs that I applied for did not hire anyone that year. And we thought that was bad. And now it's worse.
Hmm.
And so it's really tricky in these days to mentor and support, in a kind of, many of my colleagues no longer take graduate students, or, you know, those sorts of things. And it's very hard. Now, that said, Dr. Bo Ruberg is a really stellar resource, and their website, hourglasslake.com, it includes, among the many other things on that incredibly wonderful site, is a basically set of community resources, including introductions to game studies in all kinds of different ways. If you'd like a PhD, these are the kinds of ways that you can do it.
Hmm.
If you're trying to um, get yourself up to date on, Bo is a great expert in queer game studies in particular. They're currently studying queer streamers uh, as one of their kind of special focuses. And so Bo has a huge like bibliography, so that if you're like, okay, so I've decided I don't want to do a PhD, but I would like to be better informed, those resources are all over there too, which I think is really, really, really useful. But yeah, I mean, this is we're recording this. I know it's going to be released much later, but I don't think that a whole lot is going to change. Although I hope it will by the time that, maybe I hope this is a historical artifact. But at the
Let's
time of this
manifest.
recording,
Let's manifest.
yeah, yeah. At the time of this recording, Wizards of the Coast has just announced layoffs that will impact and have already impacted people who work on Dungeons and Dragons. Not so much, as far as we know, the Magic the Gathering side. Um, The Fate of Dicebreaker, one of the key like tabletop journalist outlets, is under threat. IO9 has cleaned house and fired Lynn Kodega, who this year won or was nominated for many awards for their investigative journalism into the OGL scandal. The list goes on and on.
Was that this year, the
Yeah,
OGL thing? Wow, it's
the
been a long
OGL
year.
thing was a year ago, basically, as of the time of this recording. So, December of 2022, it breaks. The full impact of it is into January, February, and March of 2023.
It's been a long year, folks. It's been a long
It's
year.
been a long year. The highs have been really high, and the lows have been what the heck. So yeah, so it's really it's one of the things that uh I think a lot of us think about how to support, because the field absolutely needs the contributions of more and more diverse voices, but how do you make sure that they can also eat,
Mm.
right? And the tabletop field is the term I tend to use because I tend to lean on Pierre Bourdieu for this. Um, Rather than industry, which is only one small part of it, or community, which is weird. Uh, but the field has a really strange relationship to money. For very few people, I actually did a Twitter poll, and Twitter polls are not scientific. This is not scientific information I'm providing at this moment in time, but it is a useful kind of straw poll where, of the folks that were engaging with me on Twitter, I asked, are you like, how would you describe your role in the TTRPG industry as of today? And so 752 people responded, which is, hey, not bad for a dying platform.
Hmm.
And less than 8% have a full time job with benefits, like a
Oh.
salaried employee position in tabletop. Another not quite 10% identify as full-time freelance, which is a capacious, people who run their own businesses that pay all their bills, so one-man shops, but also other kinds of things. Um, Another 25, maybe almost 26% freelance, but it's part-time, and then they work in other industries. So they might be an editor who both edits cookbooks, but they also edit TTRPGs, right?
Hmm.
Um, and then 57% of respondents are not currently paid, which means they are not, which I have defined and asked people to respond as, they are either not currently seeking money at all, which some people in the space, that is a thing. They don't seek remuneration in any way, shape, or form, or their work costs them more to conduct than they earn. So a majority of folks are not paid at all, or going into the red, and an overwhelming majority are not wholly sustained by the tabletop industry. Now, then I asked people what their goal was. And about half of the respondents then moved on, Twitter's weird, discoverability strange.
Hmm.
So we've got 321 votes, or poll answers, and 36, almost 37% of respondents have a goal of having a full-time career in tabletop. Uh, and another 10% say it's part of my portfolio. 32, my goal is a sustainable side project, right? Where it's not costing me anything, but it's also not necessarily my job. And then 21% basically say this is a hobby, not my job. And so what we're seeing, right, is a completely skewed distinction between what people's current realities are and what they're hoping for. And we know from other kinds of resources and other studies that are more scientific than my dumb Twitter poll that that's pretty par for the course in terms of tabletop creators historically over time. And that's not just actual play, although I think a lot of the respondents were actual play folks, but there were some design folks who are also in the mix. But for as long as this has been a thing, a group of human beings that have existed, there's been a really strange relationship between, capital professionalization, and all of that sort of thing. And you've got all these different overlaying kind of expectations and norms that are, you've got people coming from different professions into the space and thus having different kinds of expectations. A professional actor has very different expectations than a professional writer or an HR person,
Mm-hmm.
right? But also you've got different generational expectations, and you've also just got the challenge of, you know, it's a lot easier if you come from a background that means that you have a secure safety net, you can do some of that unpaid work that's going to get you into the door to something that might actually pay,
Mm.
right? And so, yeah, so which is all to distill down to, it's big old mess. And academia is not immune to the big old mess. It's just a version of the big old mess that is, um, interestingly, it rhymes in horrible, terrible ways.
So I mean, I really want to clarify. I was shocked by some of that. To
Yeah.
the point where I took my glasses off, and that's how you know it's serious. Um, they got one of those, and I think we are talking about Twitter poll. Granted, not
Right.
we said it's
So,
not scientific
yeah.
evidence.
So, as good academics, we will say, right, this skews to people who are still on this particular platform, and have particular relationships to their creative labor, all those sorts of things. Caveat, caveat, caveat.
But I
That
think
said, yeah.
like what worries me about that is that people seemingly are not getting financial reimbursement, for lack of a better term, for work that they are producing in an industry that is seemingly flourishing, question mark.
Well, it is an interesting question, right? Like, what is flourishing, right? How do we define success? How have we historically defined success? And what was the one of the fascinating things about the different voices in this semester's TTRPG classes? You had people like Maggie Baker, one of the co-creators of Apocalypse World.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, if you are playing a TTRPG these days, you have been influenced by the work of Meg Baker. Period. End of sentence. Like full stop. And she has always had a job elsewhere. She works as a museum curator, and she's very comfortable with that. And her advice to game designers is to have this as part of a sustainable side project, right? Not to have it have the success of a given game in terms of finances, basically have the ability to define your future, right? And that was the argument that she was making to my students. Granted, they heard from lots of other people who have very different kinds of relationships to this, but I think that's an important thing to bring up, is that
It's
cultural flourishing doesn't always tie or work nicely with the pressures of mass market industrial capitalism, especially now, but also ever.
so I think it's interesting because I suppose to explain what I meant by flourishing is that
Sure.
these things seem to be culturally more significant and more popular. If I was going to put a
Hmm.
finer point on it, or like no shades for comedic purposes, but Critical Role's going on a worldwide tour, right? And like a few years ago, I'm sure people would be like, "What on earth?" You know.
Hmm.
Yeah, and like so like that to me is like I feel like I know more people playing TTRPGs,
Hmm.
right? Now, obviously, as you point out, that revenue kind of doesn't necessarily directly translate as a one person buys a book and some dice, going back to the creator of said dice or book. So that's just my observation. Do
No,
you
you're
think we're
right.
actually in a potentially, and this is a phrase I've just coined, toxic melting pot of combining actual plays with content creation, because I mean, I say this as someone that streams, and I've spoken to a lot of streamers of that cycle of you need to always be producing and cross posting and being a constant, ever present person. So let's do an actual play because we all like rolling dice
Mm-hmm.
and we're all friends, and this is good. And the actual like monetization of that process, if TTRPGs actually aren't necessarily a great career, for lack of a better term, and also like content creation is also incredibly unstable,
Mm-hmm.
is that actually potentially like a dangerous point we're at where people are really inspired to try and make their hobbies a career?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, I wanna there's a really great book. She's published other things since uh this book on and has become a kind of expert in the influencer economy and the social media economy. But Brooke Aaron Duffy's kind of first foray into this was a book called Not Getting Paid to Do What You Love: Gender and Aspirational Labor in the Social Media Economy. And this predates the kind of series of booms in actual play. Her focus is also on Instagram and fashion blogs, so fashion and makeup influencers primarily. She did a bunch of interviews, that sort of thing. And what was fascinating to me about that book was, the book's written in 2017, which means the research is even earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and it echoed very much interviews and conversations was having with creators years later, up to and including today. And what Duffy emphasizes is that the primarily femme identified creators that she was interviewing were making rational decisions in the context of the rest of their working lives, and it was often generational. For example, if we want to think about Critical Role is actually a really good example of what Duffy finds among other millennial and older content creators in the social media economy, which is they have established jobs and they either have a social media presence that is tied to that job in some way, shape, or form that they then are able to monetize to one extent or another, or they have a remarkably lucrative day job that allows them, like many beauty influencers and things like that are, lawyers or real estate agents or things like that,
Mm-hmm.
or were at the time, that allows them to then build out these platforms that then some of them will choose to transition to full-time highly lucrative work, right? There's like a 1%, and then there's the broader spectrum. But what Duffy notices about the rising generations that follow is that, at least in what the folks that she's interviewing, the younger generations are not under the illusion that they are going to necessarily make their social media content creating kind of labor into a full-time job. It is a better option for them to use their time in that way than other parts of the gig economy. Because, as we've been talking about, academia itself, right? I have a tenured job. I am a magical unicorn. And it's not because I'm good, it's because I'm good, but also extraordinarily lucky. There, but for the grace of whatever, go I. And so the entire economy has moved, to the extent that it can, to adjunctification, to gig economy. And in a world where every job sucks and every job is contingent, you might as well make the choice to have some part of that portfolio into something like content creation. And thus Duffy argues these are women making a rational choice in a completely like dumpster fire of a world. That's not her phrase, that's mine, but that's only gotten more true. So what I would say is the toxicity is not necessarily coming from inside the house, it's that content creation is a way of human expression and art making that we do have some avenues towards monetization, and I think some of those are more predatory than others. But if there are folks who do it for fun, and this is the non-paying but creative expression. The kind of most high-end example of this is Hyper RPG. Hyper RPG is a company that's built out of a 17 by 17 garage, and it is a company whose money making labor is doing live streamed events for like big companies.
Mm-hmm.
And they save a creative war chest to do actual plays. Kolak is their most famous one, but there are others. And they will cobble together, like most recently they did a sponsorship with AMC for their last season. Though they're and that when I say a war chest, I mean hundreds of thousands of dollars is what this costs. And then in turn, that is not only a creative expression, they do whatever they want, but it's also they can use that as a kind of an ad spend to show off the possibilities of the technology and the expertise that they have access to. And so it kind of becomes a circle. This is something that this is part of the larger game industry as well. Brendan Keogh, in his book The Video Game Industry Does Not Exist, talks about the Australian video game making scene in very similar kinds of ways, which is we tend to think about AAA kind of big budget video game houses, but a lot of game makers are either individual or small collectives, or they're another form of getting to do what you love is this kind of combination of we're going to do work for industry in some way, shape, or form using these skills, and then we'll take a sabbatical to create a game. That's not a perfect plan, but it is one that there are many companies that follow that. So yeah, so to come back to the question of, is this all a toxic stew? Well, yeah, sure, because the world's on fire, and none and everything would look very, very different in a world of universal basic income. And I'd be very, very curious to know what this art form would look like if people didn't feel like they had to make it or had to make it in volume, right? And one of the things that's really interesting to me about actual play is that the most financially sustainable model is over in podcasting because you know it's a less expensive lift. It's still labor intensive to edit a podcast, but video editing is just 10 times more, and you're never going to compete with Critical Role and Dimension 20 in terms of just the sheer number of human beings who are on those things.
Mm-hmm.
Backstage labor that we don't talk about. One of the things that my former student and now collaborator Olivia Price and I work on is making the invisible labor of actual play production more visible to folks so that they can kind of see, how the sausage is made in those sorts of ways. But yeah, so I think it's really challenging, and I think it's what's going to be interesting is to see what happens to what I call the ambitious middle, which is to say the folks who are not making so much money that they can support a big old staff or a modest size staff, right? It's important to remember Critical Role and Dimension 20 in the scale of tabletop are huge, but that's not the scale in which they are measuring themselves. They are measuring themselves according to the scales of Hollywood, where they are extremely tiny.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and everybody who's making money in a way that like allows people to pay bills and not worry about tomorrow in a sustainable kind of way is not looking entirely in TTRPG, with a few exceptions, they have to see the larger kind of space, whatever that space is, for a particular kind of project. For actual play, that's usually, you're trying to get a new audience, not the same audience, given what we know about viewer habits or listener habits. That said, this is everything I'm saying, I have said many, many times before, but it is still not necessarily, getting communicated to the ever rising influx of folks who want to create in the space, who, the greatest story that Critical Role has ever told is the story of its own making. We are friends. We got on Twitch. Now, there and all of the things that they say about how that they rose are true, but without the historical context of what Twitch was like at the time, what their own careers were like. They weren't famous, but they were going to conventions as, invited guest, mid-level-ish famous. They had, they had runway,
Hmm.
in addition to making smart choices, and Twitch was a very different beast back then. And so I watch folks try to run the Critical Role playbook, and one has succeeded this year, and one has tried and kind of done okay, and we'll see next year if they actually kind of are able to grow past a modestly successful crowd fund, in that way. But yeah, and those are still all millennial and older creators who have careers who have managed to even have that kind of success. So we either have to redefine success, in some kind of way, and or, figure out an entirely new system. And I think the easier one is to kind of say, okay, so let's think about new ways of understanding what success looks like.
So truly, in the Scooby Doo esque fashion, this sounds of capitalism did it, and it was capitalism the whole
Why am I
time.
not wearing my dropout shirt that says capitalism is the bad guy?
It
Who can
truly
say?
truly is. I think so. This is really tangential, so do bear with me. But like
No,
you
no.
mentioned, like the ambitious middle, and
Hmm.
around this idea of like what would people do if we had universal basic income, and whenever I get into these kind of loftier debates with friends, this always sort of I relate it to say like OnlyFans creators or something, right? Like,
Mm.
this is a market that is profitable because demand, requires then creation of content, right? Like, if people could get any job they wanted to do and earn the same money, would they still do it? And it's like, it's that type of thing of like, are people doing things because capitalism has made it in such a way where we have to do what we have to do to eat and be in any way successful, depending on how we're defining that, if choosing in this instance bank balance, or is it just because like this is what they were going to do anyway? We may as well make it profitable. You know what I mean? I think it's a really
Right.
interesting idea, and I say this as someone who thought, I know, I've started a PhD. Let's also stream because that way I can talk about my research on another platform.
Yeah, I mean, and it's somewhat hypocritical of me, to say, "Oh, I stumbled into a, again, modest amount of content creator success." It's very weird to I don't it's not that's not a label I claim for myself, but I accept that it's a label that it accurately defines some of the labor that I do.
Hmm.
But it has been kind of a really interesting experience. But yeah, I mean, I think that like in an event where, um I'd be very curious to see. The ambitious middle has lots of different folks. And that's the tricky part, right? You have folks who are trying to create sustainable creative outlets for themselves, but not necessarily like, quit their day jobs because they like their day jobs. I'm thinking, for example, of John Boltana's Abraxas Precipice. He does take in a certain amount of Patreon support and things like that, and for the project, but he's not interested in making it highly monetized.
Hmm.
He's an academic librarian. He teaches a class on D&D, and this is an artistic outlet that allows him to play the game the Expanse RPG with interesting people that he can invite, and he puts a lot of time and effort into kind of improving that, but it's not about, but for him success is not about any numbers. I think it's fair to say, and if he wants to correct me, he knows where he knows where I can be found. um and and then you have folks like, I think what you're describing a lot is the labor of what we might call, right, what we call variety streamers,
Mm-hmm.
who need a certain amount of hours on Twitch or YouTube or both in order to monetize those hours in different rates, and have a certain number of viewers, right? We can all look up, the standards for becoming an affiliate or partner on Twitch or those sorts of things. And so long form live actual play on Twitch is a way of ensuring that you've got 4 hours of content on a regular basis or whatever you choose, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there is definitely part of the kind of content creation machine that uses actual play as a potential portfolio improving kind of device. And that's not to say that those shows are good or bad. They can be done well, they cannot be done well. They can show care and attention or they cannot, but that they are part of a larger portfolio of, I am a Twitch streamer. Sometimes I'm going to stream Baldur's Gate. Sometimes I'm going to stream, Dream Daddy or whatever. And then I'm going to have this actual play on my channel that also, ensures that I get to. And the number of people who say that, this is the way that they play with their friends, like, we're playing, we're remote, we might as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is the part of the ambitious middle that has identified a reality, which is that there's a certain ceiling, especially now that the studio actual plays have come back from remote, and have for a while now. And so remote productions have a certain ceiling on viewership and new audiences and that sort of thing. And so you've got this move to create studios outside of Los Angeles, in other major places, often usually in places that have existing film and television kind of resources, right? There's a reason why it's Vancouver, it's Atlanta, it's to a certain extent New York.
Mm-hmm.
It's because you've got the high concentration of creatives, you also have the tech available, you probably can get a studio space. It may or may not cost you an arm and a leg or to build or to rent. But you've got the kind of components, and maybe, just maybe, you can start to compete at a higher level. And so you've got this kind of tier, and that, because that's much more costly, in any number of ways, that is the most at risk part of actual play, as far as I can tell. It's an extremely exciting place, in terms of the growth of the medium, of the form, but it's also, you know, the the margins are razor thin, the the resources are tricky, there's a lot of moving parts, as opposed to on the podcast side, where you can batch record, you can take your time editing, those sorts of things. um yeah, I'm not
So
making this clearer, just messier.
I'm gonna have to slap myself on the wrist. I've been a terrible host in what I've aimed to do here because I've just been so enthralled by the conversation. It's incredible the depth of knowledge that you possess around
Oh,
this. Like
thank
that
you.
really, really comes out, and I
And then
love
I
that.
run my mouth too much, ding.
And this is one of the things that I love about the show. But what I also love is learning just more about you. What
Yeah,
do you do when you're not doing all of this, if anything? Because you seem like you're doing a lot all the time.
I do. And the answer to how do I do all of the things that I do is, one, I teach. I'm one of the few folks in the space that teaches at what's called in the United States an R1 designated university, which is a research at the highest intensity, which means I teach a very low teaching load, including tabletop role playing games as part of my teaching. So I've got the excuse a lot of the time to make my research into my teaching. The other thing is the beloved children in my life are my niece and nephews. And so I have high concentrations of time with them and then long stretches where they are cared for by my beloved sister
Love
and
that.
my brother. So so I mean, one of the things that we have to note is that the number of people who study actual play, we have an enormous number of junior folks. There's a group of 12 of us that are working on a book on Dimension 20, of which 5 of us have permanent positions. The other 4 that aren't me are at teaching institutions, and many of them have some combination of responsibilities to family members, young children, health concerns, that sort of thing. And then everyone else is graduate students.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I'm uniquely positioned. However, I will say I do have hobbies. The big one that I often talk about is that I lift heavy things and I put them down again. I am a arguably competitive power lifter. So I train 3 days a week.
Okay, nice. Did not see that coming. Can you hit us with like some numbers for the folks that enjoy numbers? I'm gonna pretend like I know what they
Sure.
mean.
Yeah, of course this is a group that loves numbers. So I recently did test out for new personal bests for this semester for the term. And my back squat is 255 pounds. I'm not going to give anybody metric. Sorry, guys. This is not how we roll over here. My bench is 135 and my deadlift is 305. Almost got to 3 plates, 315, but it was not in the cards this fall. So
They all
uh, th-
sound incredibly heavy. So,
they are very heavy. They're very heavy, especially for, as my very young trainer is uh, often says, for someone my age. So
ooh, okay. We're gonna leave that well alone. Because I find that to be quite rude on their part. Albeit I'm
no,
sure it's
they're
said
very
in jest.
sweet. To be fair, I started by saying they're half my age. So
Yeah, I mean, still, you know. Um, so I want. Well, this is a question that has become kind of common.
Mhm.
But with you working so intensely on TTRPGs, does that actually give you a diminishing return on your enjoyment outside of the working practice of it?
No. I what's really lovely about working in this space, at least in the way that I do it, other people's mileage may vary, but I have both locally among my own friends in both my profession and my like community and my family. uh Once it's clear that Emily knows a lot about games, suddenly people who are curious about games would like to play with you, which is really lovely. And so I have a group. We meet virtually now. We started out meeting at the American Society for 18th Century Studies academic conference, and the first time I ran a homebrew game inspired by Walpole's Strawberry Hill, and to 17 people.
Oh,
That number has shrunk, but we still meet basically every other week to play different games. We'll be playing Brindlewood Bay next weekend, and I have my home D&D game that I do not run, so I have no control over that game, except for taking notes and being the boss of everybody. We TPK'd almost exactly a year ago at the time of this recording, and it is indeed Matt Mercer's fault, but that I can put that to the side for the moment. But yeah, and then my nephew and niece are really into D&D, but also other games. I ran the Quiet Year, or as my nephew calls it, the Skulls game, for his entire little Montessori class last spring. It's a really great game to run for kids, as it turns out, because when you're taking your turn, no one else can talk. If everyone else doesn't like what's happening, they can take one of those contempt tokens, one of those skulls to show that they have contempt, but they have to let people take their turns, which is really lovely.
The
But yeah,
skulls
so
make it
no,
sound
it's
so Lord of the Flies.
it is it but and yet it's about kind of community building and learning that being a human in relationship in the world is indeed quite challenging. Especially if you've added robot monster zombie chickens to the map as part of the game. So,
I love
but
to
yeah,
see
no,
it.
it's yeah, it's really, I think it helps that I'm surrounded by TTRPG scholars, folks who are more directly studying the games themselves. And that's not my beat, so to speak. So I can kind of retain the joy of playing whatever I want and not feeling like, oh, I have to play this game if it's not my, because it's important as opposed to because it's of interest to me.
Hmm.
So yeah, that helps.
So this is a completely off the wall question, but it is someone who studies English literature and is a narratologist. I'm still saying that right. It's such a good word. Um,
Dermatologist, yeah.
do you have any thoughts, opinions, or feelings on that Bob Dylan won a Nobel Prize recently? I say recently, it's a few
Um,
years back now, but that was for writing. Was it for literature or poetry? I can't remember which.
yeah, I mean, I don't have intense thoughts about it. I certainly can think of any number of other human beings who probably, like, arguably deserve it more. But again, it's been interesting because this week already I've had multiple conversations about what awards are for.
Okay, I mean, yeah, that's
It's in
the whole
yeah,
thing, right?
and so it's like, okay, so what is the Nobel Prize for? I don't know. It has not been made clear to me because, so often it's just it seems more tied into, right, this is, sorry guys, we're coming back to French theory, we're coming back to Bourdieu, right, the notion of fields of cultural production is about awards are part of the shaping of those fields by, in theory, making alternate forms of power aside from capital and state power. And the Nobel Prize doesn't really seem to do that very often, but I that's probably more cynical than you know.
I'm gonna attempt to top that and say I believe there's a cash prize. No wonder people are always going for that peace one. You know. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you like cynical, I feel like we would really get on if we just went for like really went for a pint and like put the world to rights. You know what I mean? I feel like a lot of our views we maybe share on that side
Yeah,
of
well,
things.
that's the other lovely thing about the tabletop spaces. If you can find, there's lots of different pockets. There's not one community, there's many, but there are communities in addition to the larger kind of field and industry and space where you can be like, ah, yes, you get it. You care about the same things I do, which is always a lovely thing.
So we're gonna kind of, and this is on me as a host, but we're gonna kind of switch pace and ask sort of two of my favorite
No, totally
questions.
fine.
Um, the first one is, and we maybe have already touched around the field and of it, but you have access to unlimited people, time, resource, expertise, whatever you need. What's one blue sky, magic wand, project, experiment, study you would like to do? Totally fair answer if you just
Um,
say finance the TTRPG industry properly.
I mean, I think that's part of it. I mean, I've asked this before in different kinds of ways, and I think that in terms of the answer that I would give that I don't think other people would, it would be that we need to figure out archival workflows for the TTRPG. Like, the Strong Museum of Play exists, Duke Rubenstein Library has some holdings in tabletop. um, there are places where a lot of games are being kind of preserved. And I think expanding that, right, to include more, we have protocols for kind of cataloging zines and things like that. So those kind of more uh, kind of uh, one off or harder to find physical copies of games. But for me, one of the things that I notice, especially around actual play, is we are very much, Jason Carl has said this, and I agree with him. This is a medium that's in its infancy, kind of the way that early television was. And as we all know, right, much of the history of early television is lost to us because the recordings were not seen as important to preserve, and so either reels were reused or were just not stored properly. So right, so this is the most vivid thing that folks in our nerdish neck of the woods will know or should know is, right, there's whole swaths of Doctor Who that did not survive
Mm-hmm.
because of the days of early television and preservation. And so, one of the things that I'm trying to do as a historian of the form is to try to tell the history as best I can, in part in order to both support creators who are trying to make the case that this is an art form when seeking funding and other kinds of things, but also so that we can start the ball rolling on figuring out what we preserve, how we preserve it, right? It's probably not going to be like, we download everything, but are there ways that we can preserve for future scholars something that allows us to study this form, as we get the kind of benefit of the long view. With a lot of money, reality is like I would also like to solve climate change before that.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, in terms of my own neck of the woods, yeah, it's, man, these blue sky things are really funny because I just finished writing a whole mess of grants about actual play, both for myself and for my research collective, for the small interventions that we can do
Mm-hmm.
uh, at the moment, which yeah, it's scooping water out of the ocean.
Preservation is so interesting as well because, like, obviously from my side with like video games specifically, as we move to more digital only, release and things, that means we can lose games entirely.
Hmm.
These pieces of art, again, depending on people's perspective individually, can just be gone from history. Like,
Hmm.
we have the technology, we have the ability to restore things like cartridges and discs, but if a game is only ever released digitally and then gone, and like, was it this was it in 2023, I think, Nintendo entirely closed their old eShop on the Nintendo 3DS platforms and the Wii U platform.
Yes.
So all of those digital only contents that only got released on those platforms, gone, lost to the annals of time, unless someone happens to buy it, keep it on their system, and then finds a way of transporting that somewhere else. It's
Exactly.
a huge problem for the gaming industry entirely.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing. So I've been teaching half my life. So I've been teaching, I was revising a letter of recommendation today, and could actually use the phrase in my 20-year teaching, my 2-decade teaching career. But what's been really interesting, especially this year, has been to discover that students are finally intuitively understanding, and the larger kind of audiences are finally understanding that digital is not permanent.
Mm-hmm.
Digitization doesn't save things from loss inherently, but also that the digital is physical, right? Hard drives, all of these sorts of things. And we're finding it out the hard way, right? From, Netflix and Hulu and Max and things, taking things off, uh, for a variety of different kinds of reasons, from consumer access, but also other, flash support,
Yeah.
degrading means that, yeah, flash games and much, I am not homestuck. Is that what, I'm so old? But I've been following the history and reading a little bit about the history of the ways in which, you cannot encounter that web series in the way in which it was originally intended, and it is not that old.
Well, I mean, I
Pres-
remember Newgrounds. that was a Flash, the Flash
Hmm.
website. People, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like that was a huge part of like my childhood, really. Um,
Yeah. So the other hat that I wear that we have not talked about but is pertinent here is as a digital humanist, a lot of my work has been around creating reliable metadata for discovery. In other words, making search engines that actually show you the things that are useful. Um, and also thinking very seriously about what preservation is and isn't possible, what is sustainable digital labor and preservation looking like.
I also
And there are,
love the
yeah.
kind of the paradoxical nature of like not everything digital is permanent, but also like the antithesis of that is kind of used whenever you whenever you post something online, it exists forever. Like that photo you sent, it exists on a server somewhere, and like if it's been ever re-downloaded, it's gonna exist forever. And like the kind of the paradoxy of both of those things happening at once.
And absolutely. It's a real kind of fascinating challenge, right? Like that we are simultaneously having a crisis of the durability of digital media, the things that we thought we would have access to forever or what have you, um, alongside the fight for the right to be forgotten as children who were exploited as young children are now coming of age and don't want a functionally their baby photo album, plastered all over YouTube, and initiating takedowns and other kinds of things to make that happen.
I
Um,
really feel like I could speak to you for like another 3 hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. Um, just because like this is like the type of conversation I love to have, and I feel like again like you know so much, and you seem to have a numerous number of hats. We haven't even like you probably have a number
Too
of
many
hats.
hats.
Your
Too
hat
many
collection
hats.
probably rivals the collection behind you on the shelves. I would surmise that
Aw, thanks.
from our conversation. So one of my other questions, I think it's my favorite on the show, if I'm honest, but
Hmm.
is there anyone that you would like to give a shout out to? Someone you'd like to shine the spotlight on, who you maybe just don't think gets enough, love, or you want to send your school appropriate, but you want to send a bit of affection to over the podcast.
Absolutely. So, the thing that I tend to hype, I have nothing to do with, I'll just say from the jump. But if you are interested in actual play as a form and either are creating it or are trying to find more shows to love and support that might not get that kind of love, seriesseeker.com is a functional a search engine and gateway. Folks who have created actual plays can put information in there, and you can use it to search. Now, it's a not the most elegant of searches. If you put in that you're looking for, several different things, it's going to show you all the things from all of those different categories. But you can start to look for actual plays of a particular length or audio quality or a system that you're interested in, dozens and dozens of systems, neurodivergent or other kinds of representation in the cast, all those kinds of good things. And so that's the kind of thing I would really, really lead with. The other thing I'll just say as a kind of addendum to that is that it's worth following either the socials or the websites for the different web fests that support and judge and have award categories for actual play. New Jersey was the first, Minnesota was the next, Los Angeles, and I want to say New Zealand have there's more being added to a kind of ring of actual play supporting webfests all the time. And New Jersey Webfest tends to spotlight all of the ones that are kind of coming on board. So I have a relationship to New Jersey. I am a judge. I judged, I think, 60 actual plays this year
Wow.
for the Webfest, 30-minute slots at a time, but and sometimes several times for some of those. But I think that's the other way that we're going to start to be able to talk about value beyond how much money did you make, how many viewers did you get, is through those kinds of initiatives.
I mean, that's a great answer. That's not
Yeah,
one I can
thank
say I've
you.
heard before, and they sound great. Because I think one of the things that, like,
Hooray.
if I was gonna say something maybe controversial in this context, is I kind of struggle with actual plays a little bit.
Hmm.
Like, just mostly because of the sheer amount of content kind of scares me. But that's not just
Hmm.
those, that happens with TV shows. So like something like allows me to like filter through by length and things like that sounds great.
Yeah, because I'm a big believer that there's no one platonic ideal of what an actual play can be. Critical Role is appealing to its core audience precisely because it's doing things that are actually really off-putting to everyone else. It's not edited, it's quite long. It is, for all its the critiques that Critical Role does is not real, man, they hem and haw and plan and dick around in ways that are very reminiscent of my own table,
Hmm.
in terms of just, not taking action. And so, I think that what's really lovely about the form is that once you find the thing that you love, there's a magic that happens, and it's not for everybody, but there's lots of different, kind of ways of tasting that I think, not everybody has to be not every show has to be for everybody, but you know, I think it's worth taking a look around. And but yeah, it is hard. Um I will say there are some like video first actual plays that I find it easier to listen to, and which I think is a really interesting phenomenon. And I think, our brain chemistry also works in different kinds of ways. And some actual plays aren't thinking about any of that stuff in terms of audience, and that's a real challenge too. But yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stories being told out there.
And
Worth taking a look. I give every show that gets pitched to me 15 to 30 minutes. Um, and that can usually tell me if uh, either I'm interested in listening to it more, or if I think other people might be interested, even if it's not, my particular cup of tea.
and there's a cup of tea for everyone. You know what I mean?
It, except for people, well, yeah, no, I was going to say, except for people who can't take caffeine. And then I realized, no, there's a world of tisanes and herbal blends and things like that. The high likelihood is that if you think that there's not an actual play out there, you probably haven't been looking hard enough. But yeah, lots of good stuff out there.
All right. So, if you would indulge me in some fun quick fire questions.
Sure.
You are going to a biome of your choice. When I say biome, because I wouldn't go to a desert island. Personal preference. I'll be no props. But to take along with you, you're taking one film, one album,
Mm.
one book, and one video game or game of your choice. Now, if it comes as a
Hmm.
collection, as a box set, you can have it. You can have a TV show instead of film. Everything you have there will work magically. You'll have access to power, energy, etc. What are you taking with you?
Oh boy. Um, so uh I think, and this is in part, I think, because I have it on the brain. But the book I come back to the most with pleasure is Dorothy Sayers' Gaudy Night, which is she's a golden age of detective fiction. It's the one that is set in a fictional Oxford women's college. It's a really interesting meditation in all kinds of ways. It just keeps on giving. Um, if I had to pick the most important video game to me, it would be Loom, period, end of sentence. A student wormed their way into my heart by proposing music mechanics for a tabletop game inspired by Loom. But if I have all of this time on a desert island, then it's gonna either be Disco Elysium or Baldur's Gate, just because, that those things are going to give you a lot of time. Like I do not have currently the time to go through all of the different.
So I didn't want to pigeonhole or appear to be pigeonholing anyone, but I kind of guessed that you would pick a game like that. Surprise, surprise.
Which one? Loom, Disco, or Baldur's Gate 3?
But the latter two, just because it's like, oh, they're games that have lots of choices with lots of consequence, and I bet you're the type of person that would want to do every single one.
Yes. We'll see how many I get through. I'm thinking about it as a game I want to play. Like there are some games that you want to play with different people in your life,
Hmm.
and that is very much what I'm very curious about. Is like, is Baldur's Gate 3 my new personality test? This is very curious. Um, album. There's a lot of things I've been replaying a lot these days, but I think if I'm stuck on a desert island, it's going to be Music for Airports by Brian Eno, just because I think that's the good vibe
Hmm.
there, which is hilarious because my kind of day-to-day life is much more kind of De La Soul driven these days, or so says my Spotify, on repeat, and Kendrick Lamar. But no, Desert Island means you gotta have it more something more ambient.
Hmm.
Um, and so yeah, so got book, we got video game, we've got album taken care of. Film is going to go kind of like not be as important. I'm like notoriously a terrible like movie
You can
person.
take a TV
Uh
show if you prefer a box set.
no. Um, oh, then I want yes. Then I want
The sound
uh
you're hearing is furious googling.
no. Uh I want no, that is not the case at all. I want I I don't know if it exists in a box set, but if I can have Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes in
Oh,
a full box set,
yeah. Okay.
um,
Narratively, I'll give you that one. That
then
that would be that
there
would
we
be very
go.
enjoyable.
Um, and yeah, I that's again like something I feel like I could spend more time thinking about and meditating over. What an interesting combination a class of Life on Mars plus Disco Elysium would be now that I think about it.
Do you have a
My student
preference for Life on Mars versus Ashes to Ashes?
Oh, good question. I mean, I think ultimately Life on Mars is stronger because it's the first. Um, although the ending to Ashes, like, you know, I don't know, works for me better in some ways. I am disappointed that like then they never did didn't they propose? I think they proposed a like a third series that I don't remember the name of, but it came nothing came of it. I think because of COVID.
I do think like
Um,
that's the type of thing that a trilogy would have really finished it off.
yeah. Um, but I mean I felt like Ashes to Ashes like felt like it came together, but also yeah, I could do more. I could do more. Yeah, so let's just add the imaginary trilogy of whatever the third thing.
Hey, it's
um
it's it's your imaginary place.
but no, it's yeah, I'm teaching a class in the spring. I teach a large literature course for 120 students every spring, and I polled them, and and it's British literature 1789 to the present, and so of the choices they voted for like overwhelmingly for the history of mysteries, along with a good rallying for weird experiments and works about friendship. So we're doing Caleb Williams, which Broadview has this amazingly sexy cover of a brooding gentleman from the early 20th century. Nope. No, actually, 1848. It's almost actually appropriate. And then we'll look at the Moonstone and Griffin and Sabine and Gaudy Night. Um, But now that I think about it, I should be like, oh, what an interesting class it would be to include part of life on Mars. I don't think I could pull it off this time around. But
I mean, you could
if
definitely
this
include
keeps
it as like
going,
a latter like retrospective of a period of time, because obviously Life on Mars tried to make a lot of political points at the time, and like how someone from the future actually was like, no, this you don't have to be like this. Things are not this way now. Um,
yeah, I mean it's interesting, right? Like, um, you know, British series are shorter, but they're still it's yeah, so it'd be interesting to see like could you pick a representative episode. Now I have homework, damn it. Um
that's not what the
you
podcast's
know,
for.
there we go. Yeah, I mean cuz like I could run an episode for a day of class. My students would be I think very pleased or would hate me. I don't know. But
They'll just be like, we can't
yeah.
understand what anyone's saying.
Oh, that well, I went to my master's program at York and it was always fascinating who couldn't understand whose accent, and the only universal was the woman from Chicago. Many people could not understand. Uh, Broad Yorkshire was nothing compared to Upper Midwest, apparently.
Interesting. The things that now no one
Indeed.
expected to learn that on this episode. So, the last sort of like formal kind of question I have is I like to turn the tables upon myself and offer you, the guest, the chance to ask me a question. As always, the rules are please don't ask me about the PhD. It's a
I was
horrible,
gonna say the mean question would be how's the dissertation or
yeah,
or
wait,
coursework going?
rude question to ask a PhD person.
Indeed.
And I've also had the biodome question previously. But is there anything else you'd like to ask me?
So the question that I ask all the guests for my class is if you could recommend a game that my students would play, what game would you recommend and why?
Does it have to be like board game or video game?
Analog games, uh, generally speaking, we tend to focus on tabletop role-playing games, although we make some kind of exceptions for games that, kind of skirt the line of definitions, that kind of thing. We've the first version of this class like included something like Disco Elysium because we were being a little bit more capacious, but these days students are really interested in things they can hold and touch and tangibility. So I am happy to provide that.
Okay, so I'm gonna approach this from two different angles. One
Hey.
is just a game that I enjoy playing, which is I'm gonna go with Boss Monster. It's a card game, board game. You are the boss at the end of a dungeon, and you build the dungeon to lure heroes in, and you win by harvesting their souls. You lose if you take too many wounds. And it's brilliant for its pop culture and its representation and graphics. Like they just look so cute and wonderful, but it's also like deeply strategic and incredibly fun in a way that like gets you thinking about how it's fun to flip the tables, right? You're the big boss, you're the big bad, and like actually yes, I'm mercilessly luring heroes from town and slaughtering them in various funny ways, as well as like just genuine fun of like drawing cards and trying to screw with your opponent, right? So that's like my kind of like if you're gonna just play a game and that be fun. I think another one in terms of things that I enjoy from an analog perspective, I'm gonna say maybe you've heard it, Heroes of Barcadia.
Hmm.
This would be a big hit with the students because that's like it's a quote unquote drinking game, but you can use any beverage, and you have a character. The liquid is their HP. You uncover tiles. You roll d20s to take out what's there. You pick up items. You have to find the villain that stole the drink hoard. It's a great way to stay hydrated and roll dice and flip tiles, and they're all waterproof and it's all silly and fun. But it's a great way to then sort of like for me at least, I played it with friends that had like never played tabletop, but they very
Hmm.
quickly found themselves being more like their characters that were on these little cups, you know. And it was really funny to see how like essentially like we had created a narrative when there wasn't one, and that wasn't the objective, but suddenly we're all on this quest to recover these drinks. Us, then drinking beverages that had a percentage might have facilitated that to some degree as we went on, but yeah, I'd say those two are two games that I think would go down a treat in class.
Hooray! Well, I follow instructions. In fact, in the next room, I have Meg Baker recommended the Bullwinkle and Rocky role-playing party game, and that just arrived from eBay, so I'm very excited. It has puppets, which I'm very excited
I
about.
wish I had a more intellectual answer for you. If I'm being honest, I really like. I have been involved in a book that's like learning education games, and I reviewed chapters on. I think one was on like thirsty sword lesbians. That would have been a much more intellectual answer, but I can't remember
No, I
what was
don't
in that
think there's
chapter. You know,
No, I don't think there's a bad answer to that question, like truly. And what was very cool about well, the every recommendation has been awesome, I think, and has kind of helped me kind of look slant, but like Meg's were the Rocky and Bullwinkle role-playing party game, Tunnels and Trolls, Monsters, and Prime Time Adventures, which is like has a character arc, mechanic and a fan mail mechanic and all those sorts of things. And I thought those were really lovely in the same way that like Boss Monster, like, you know, uh easy to like pick up but like expose and think about and have a new kind of interesting idea or an interesting kind of mechanic that shows how things and uh you know anything that has particular kinds of stuff. Like one of my students was super interested in, they each student adopts a TTRPG, so they
they
adopted 10
adopt.
candles.
That's cute.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, it's adopt. And so they take it home. They take my copy home, and hopefully I get it back, or they don't pass the class. And I buy them with Polygon money when I've got it, or other kinds of what have yous. And then they kind of do different research tasks. Did the game win awards? If not, who did the year that the game was published and the year after? What games is this game inspired by or inspired in turn? We discussed definitions of indie. Is it indie? What seems to be the central metaphor of your game? How do your game mechanics contribute to its meaning? Is your game performable? Should it be an actual play? Has it been an actual play? And then they play the game outside of class, either with classmates who can get course credit for helping out, or with their friends and family who are a captive audience. Some of them did solo journaling games. But yeah, so they get to kind of live with a game for a good long time. And then in class, I'm trying to show them quickly like games we can play, in a class session or a couple of class sessions, uh, you know, and that have different kinds of interesting ideas, everything from, The Quiet Year and For the Queen to something like Alice is Missing, which is played with cell phones
Mm.
and has a soundtrack, and everything in between. And one of these days I'll be able to do Dread. I'll have a bunch of
Jenga
Jenga
blocks.
towers that we
Yeah.
don't call Jenga towers. We'll see. It's very interesting. Um, at the time of this recording,
Jeremy
it's
bury
such
me,
a fun
baby. Jeremy
phrase.
bury me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's at the time of this recording, um, I do not know when I will teach this class again, in part because of all of these grants I've just written. If those are successful, then I get to take a break to actually write the book on actual play and do things like make site visits and all those sorts of lovely things. And that is a necessary part of the process, but also I'm going to miss it if I'm lucky enough to have a little bit of time to travel and to write and to think. So yeah, it's very weird to be like, oh, I don't know if next fall is the class. We'll see. By the time this airs, we will know.
We will know.
Actually,
Well, I'll keep things crossed for the grants for you in the meanwhile,
thank you.
because
Yeah.
I can appreciate.
Well, and it will mean something, not to be overly grandiose about it, but in the same way that I applied for one grant because Bo Ruberg had previously been funded for queer streamers, which then made it clear that there was a possibility that there was a space for actual play in that kind of funding remit. You know, we all lift as we climb. We
Hmm.
do this work together. None of us are doing it by ourselves. Even when we're writing individual dissertations and theses and books and articles and things. So yeah.
What a great note to roll the episode on. That's beautiful.
Hooray!
Last but obviously not least, where can people find you on the interwebs?
Yes. So I always own the means of production at EC Friedman. That's FRIEDMAN.com. For the moment, you can continue to find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Fried. That's FRIEDE, Fried E. I'm available at Critical Prof on Instagram and YouTube on a channel that I co-own with my lovely collaborator, Dr. Emily Kugler. We're two 18th centurists who have been each thinking about games in different kinds of ways. And we put our virtual talks and things like that on there. That's also where my teaching videos and recaps and things like that are as well.
Definitely not gonna check that out myself as the week carries on. I don't like to do it before because I don't like to research guests. That's my party line. Um, I like to just get on, just chit
Emergent,
chatting.
emergent gameplay and emergent interviewing.
That's how a good podcast should be, in my view. I wouldn't produce anything I wouldn't listen to. I'll say that. Anyway, uh, Emily, thank you so much for joining me. I have greatly appreciated your company. I hope that the listeners have taken away even half as much as I have, and they will have learned much more than they might do otherwise on any other given day. But
My very great pleasure.
all that remains for me to say is thank you. Thank anyone for listening or watching. I'll click the button that makes the video say thanks for watching, and goodbye.